And the annual UN Climate Summit opens in Azerbaijan as negotiators brace for a tough 2 weeks of talks on financing the climate crisis, while the re-election of Donald Trump as US president and trade concerns cloud discussions in Baku. And staying on that story, the COP29 summit has begun, with delegations from more than 190 countries convening in Azerbaijan's capital of Baku. Now, this year's summit is being referred to as a technical COP, with climate finance as the overarching theme. On what it all means and what's at stake, we're joined here by CNA editor Liling and our climate correspondent Jack Board, who's on the ground in Baku, and the other co-hosts of CNA's Climate Conversations podcast. Now, Liling, let's start with you. What can we expect this year out of this so-called technical COP?
Hey, Angela, it's called the Technical COP, or Conference of the Parties, because a big part of it will be about working out the details to follow through on some of the key climate financing pledges and commitments that have come out of the previous summit. So there'll be negotiations around what's known as Article 6. We're talking about, first of all, how to set the rules for countries to buy and sell carbon credits with each other, but also how to implement a United Nations-backed marketplace for carbon credits as well. Now, there will also be discussions around how to turn talk into action on loss and damage, the fund that was agreed on last year at COP28 in Dubai. And this is basically funding for countries that have suffered losses and damages from climate change-related events, countries that bear the brunt of global warming but are not among the biggest carbon polluters. And we'll have negotiations around something new as well, a new global climate financing goal called, and this is a bit of a mouthful, it's called the New Collective Quantified Goal. Not a very catchy name, but it's the cornerstone of this COP summit. And the aim is to help developing countries transition to clean energy, but also to help them adapt to the effects of climate change. And this will replace the current finance goal of $100 billion a year. Now, some estimates say developing countries need about another $500 billion to $1 trillion a year. So we're looking at a whole lot more money that might be needed, that will be negotiated. So lots on the agenda, but there is one thing threatening to hijack a lot of the attention. And that's, of course, the re-election of Donald Trump as U.S. president. Now, this is, of course, the man who famously withdrew from the Paris climate deal during his first term as president. And for more on what to expect out of that, we've got Jack Board, our eyes and ears on the ground. Jack, hello there. Hey, what's happening as the summit begins and how... Hi. So what's happening there as the summit begins? You're on the ground. How much is the Trump factoring in?
Yeah, we're only about 30 minutes actually from the COP summit officially opening. And Mr. Trump, of course, is not here. He's also not the president for a couple more months, but his election has already upended global climate talks and probably put a throttle on what could reasonably be expected out of these talks. As you've kind of gone through there's a lot of money that is expected to be raised. But when you have President Trump about to be in office saying that climate change is a hoax, that climate change is a scam, it doesn't quite bode well for elevating the types of discussions that need to occur here at COP29. Now, of course, he withdrew the United States from the Paris Agreement last time when he was the president. We expect that he would do the same thing again. He could also withdraw the US from various other types of climate mechanisms and frameworks. So that will have a destabilizing impact on this whole UN process. So you've talked about all the billions and trillions of dollars. How can we expect to come up with trillions of dollars to replace that $100 billion climate goal that you mentioned if you don't have the biggest economy in the world on board? So that's a real looming question for this summit. What to do in the absence of US leadership. And there's plenty of evidence that the world is in dire need of more action. Climate scientists have told us just in the run-in to this summit that the world is currently on track for 3.1 degrees of warming by the end of the century. So that's a far cry from what the Paris Agreement is calling for, which is 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees of global warming.
How do you think the Trump factor will play into progress towards negotiating on the things we talked about earlier, Article 6, the loss and damage fund? To what extent will the Trump factor derail these talks or perhaps negatively affect them?
I think it's going to have a huge process, a huge impact, rather. I mean, you have the absence of, one of the most important stakeholders in all of these discussions. Just as a small example, I've been walking around the summit this morning. A lot of countries have national pavilions. It's kind of a showcase of the action that they've been doing. They have talks, they have politicians, industry leaders attending there. The United States pavilion is totally empty, no decorations, it's completely austere. And I think that is a little bit of a symbolic sign of just how invested the US is now in this process. Even, a few months ago, if we had a different election outcome, we might have expected the US to be more involved. So what happens from here, and who can step in to that void? Could it be China? And that's a pretty interesting discussion. I think China has consistently categorized itself as a developing nation, which means it doesn't have to be a donor to all of these various climate funds. It doesn't give money to the loss and damage fund, for example. Could China pivot to becoming a donor nation? And what would that mean in terms of its influence over a lot of these talks and negotiations? Now, conversely, we could see China actually do the same as the United States, withdraw, start to follow its own path and say, if the US isn't contributing to any of these funds or any of these discussions, neither would we. So closely watching the power structures and dynamics, given what we're expecting from the US, over the next few years.
Okay. Now, Jack, we've heard that you've had an extensive interview with the CEO of COP29, Elena Sultanov, who is, as it appears, embroiled in a bit of a scandal. Just a few days ago, he was secretly filmed promoting fossil fuel deals. Now, what do you make of that? And is this taking the wind out of the sails at COP29, or do you think it will galvanize more action?
Look, it's certainly a pretty embarrassing start, I think, for the COP presidency. Of course, Elnur Sultanov, who is the CEO of the COP presidency, he's also a deputy energy minister in Azerbaijan, as you mentioned, secretly filmed, offering the ability to connect with the state oil and gas energy firm and do deals on the sidelines of the summit. And obviously, that appears to be in breach of the code of conduct for the COP presidency. Now, Azerbaijan, of course, is a petrostate. They're unabashed in their willingness to continue along a path that promotes fossil fuels. 90% of the country's exports are oil and gas, so not a big surprise that they would be promoting some of those interests here. Whether that's compatible with being the leader of the COP, that's a different debate. They are also pursuing their own green technology agenda. They're setting up, various large-scale solar energy plants, for example. And I did have a sit-down with the COP CEO that was filmed before these allegations emerged, but he did admit that fossil fuels are here to stay, and Azerbaijan will be continuing to use the resources that it has. Although he did also say that they have contributed to some of the damage that the planet has been experiencing because of climate change. Take a listen to what he had to say.
The entire world economy is based on hydrocarbons. We like it or not, that's a matter of fact. And every country in the world is an oil country, either producer country or consumer country or both. We are basically currently producing around 0.5% of gas and 0.5% of oil. And our oil production levels are going down. And this is also part of the deliberate policy by the government. And as we see that traditional way of development now destroying the world, I think we are very ready to become part of this third energy revolution and be at the forefront of this third green energy revolution, if you like.
It's also important to note that a hard stop on fossil fuels was never really on the cards, was it, Jack? There are economic realities, social implications, especially for poor developing countries. For example, what happens if we stop gas and oil overnight? What keeps the lights on, the cooker's cooking, the heater's running? And that's why the focus is on transition at these COP summits rather than a hard stop on fossil fuels. And remember, it took countries 3 decades of these climate talks to even agree on transitioning away from fossil fuels, and that was only accomplished last year in Dubai. So a historic moment then, but not this year, maybe not so much excitement, right, Jack? We're seeing a more muted turnout. Leaders of the biggest polluters, the heaviest hitters, not gonna show up. We've got a list of no-shows here. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, America's Joe Biden not showing up, China's Xi Jinping, Russia's Vladimir Putin. And I don't know if you saw this, Jack. Papua New Guinea, which faces a huge risk from climate change, says it's and I quote, a total waste of time. So what does this tell us about how big a deal this COP is going to be or not going to be?
Yeah, I think it's really telling that a lot of world leaders have decided that this isn't really worth their time, the resources, the political capital they might have to come and negotiate here in Azerbaijan. It should be noted that this is a technical COP. There aren't sort of the big announcements of ambitions, of new goals for countries. So not surprising that it's the world leaders who are deciding to stay away, and they're leaving the technical work up to their various ministries to sort out. I think they're also keeping their powder dry a little bit. Of course, next year, COP30 will be held in Brazil in the Amazon rainforest. It will be 10 years since the Paris Agreement. We are expecting far more levels of ambition to be announced there. So I think leaders are hedging their bets, saying this is not the important moment for them to come and showcase to their own people, of course, that COP29 matters, and they're going to be saving it for next year.
And going into this summit as well, there was a lot of talk about global events competing for attention. And we've spoken about this several times. You've spoken to some people there as well about it. What are some of the issues that's taking bandwidth away from this summit?
Yeah, I think that's part of the same discussion that we're talking about world leaders not coming. If we take a look at global affairs right now, it doesn't paint a particularly bright picture. We have economies that are continuing to struggle. We've had a number of elections this year which have reshaped global politics, reshaped the relationships that countries have with each other. And then, of course, unprecedented levels of conflict that continue to rage around the world. That impacts energy markets, that impacts the types of mutual levels of cooperation and trust that are needed to get good outcomes. Here at COP29, Ukraine is ongoing, Gaza is ongoing, a pretty hot conflict in Sudan. And I've spoken to several experts who say this just doesn't really bode well for good levels of cooperation that are so essential, and the outcome is likely to be an increase in the deficit between what climate and conflict vulnerable nations are needing and what richer nations are willing to put on the table. Of course, COP29 has also been framed by the presidency as a truce COP. They wanted to have a global ceasefire that would coincide with this summit. No indications that will stick, but they are certainly pushing climate as a vehicle to promote peace. And these are two issues that are closely intertwined. They're linked together. They feed one another. I think that's overlooked a lot in these conversations. Countries that are vulnerable to conflict are vulnerable to climate change, and putting money into climate measures to help those nations will, in turn, reduce the amounts of conflict that we're seeing. So all of the money needs to be channeled. Exactly which avenues are chosen and whether countries are willing to put that money on the table, given what's happening around the world, we'll be watching over the next 2 weeks.
An uphill battle indeed for this COP29. Thank you, Jack. And that's our update for you. Angela, back to you.
Liling, Jack, thank you both for that COP29 look ahead. And that's Jack Board and Liling Tan, who are co-hosts of CNA's Climate Conversations podcast.